Imagine this. A military commander. He's right on the very edge of just catastrophic defeat.
Yeah.
And he's actually drafting a letter to his property manager back home,
Right.
meticulously detailing fireplace renovations for his country estate.
It sounds almost unbelievable, doesn't it?
Or how about this? A general who's, pretty well known for his gambling habits. And he seems to be completely ignoring a really detailed psychological profile of his main opponent, the guy he's supposed to be fighting.
It's these kinds of details, these sort of contradictory moments that really jump out.
Exactly. These aren't just like weird historical footnotes. They're these vivid, almost jarring glimpses into the year 1776, a really turbulent, often agonizing year that somehow, against all odds, truly forged a nation.
Yeah, it's a year we usually think about with fireworks, parades, often focusing almost entirely on signing the Declaration.
Right, the big moment.
But the reality, and this is what we really want to get into in this deep dive, it was so much more complex, much grittier, filled with these agonizing human decisions, moments of just profound despair, and also these unsung moments that completely shaped America.
It's not just what happened.
No, it's how it happened. And the incredible, sometimes really unexpected human spirit that somehow pushed it all forward.
And that really brings us right to the heart of today's deep dive. Our main guide through this absolutely pivotal year is David McCullough's fantastic book, 1776.
A really powerful book.
Oh, absolutely. And what the book does so well, I think, is really bring to life the extraordinary challenges. I mean, the sheer scale of what this fledgling army and its leader, George Washington, were up against.
Yeah, he was determined, but also deeply burdened. You feel that weight.
You really do. And the book actually opens with a quote from Washington himself, which kind of sets the tone for everything we're about to talk about. He wrote, "Perseverance and spirit have done wonders in all ages."
And that quote, it's quiet, but it's so powerful. It really captures the mission, I think, of this deep dive. We're aiming to pull back the curtain on 1776.
Go beyond the usual story.
Exactly. Move beyond those simplified, celebratory narratives. Our goal is to try and understand the sheer human effort involved. The moments of, frankly, deep despair that gripped everyone, leaders and soldiers alike.
And those unexpected turning points.
Yeah, the often unexpected, almost miraculous turning points that genuinely led towards independence. It's really about the raw, unfiltered truth of 1776. How this group of determined people, against absolutely overwhelming odds, somehow managed to create something completely new.
So to really get a feel for how precarious things were for the Americans, we kind of have to start by looking at the contrast. The huge difference between the imperial confidence back in London and the really stark reality Washington was facing in late 1775.
Absolutely. That contrast is key. On one side, you've got the most powerful monarchy in the world, supremely confident they're going to win, and with huge public support.
Yeah.
Take October 26, 1775. King George III makes this grand procession to Parliament. He's going to deliver his speech from the throne.
Big occasion.
Huge. An estimated 60,000 people are lining the route through St. James's Park. Westminster's just packed solid, all just to catch a glimpse of the king.
And the spectacle itself, that golden chariot, you described it earlier, just colossal.
Oh, it was astonishing. 24 feet long, 13 feet high, nearly 4 tons. Pulled by 8 of those magnificent Hanoverian creams. It wasn't just transport. It was pure theater.
Designed to impress.
Totally. With gilded cherubs on top for England, Scotland, Ireland holding a crown, and then 4 gilded sea gods over the wheels, reminding everyone that, Britannia ruled the waves.
Right. It's pure power projection.
Exactly. Samuel Curwen, he was an American loyalist in London then. He actually tried twice just to see the king. Eventually, he only caught a glimpse of, quote, "the whitest hand my eyes ever beheld with a very large rose diamond ring," because the king was holding a newspaper so close to his face.
That's quite a detail.
But it shows. This wasn't just a parade. It was this carefully orchestrated display, projecting absolute power, divine right, really underlining the overwhelming might these American rebels were daring to challenge.
And the king himself, George III, he wasn't just some remote figurehead, was he?
No, not at all. By many accounts, he had this sort of unaffected good nature. Samuel Johnson, the great writer and critic of the era, famously called him the finest gentleman I have ever seen.
Hype praise.
Very. And the king had diverse interests. He spent hours studying ship models. He was an amateur astronomer, charting stars. He even founded the Royal Academy of Arts.
So, not the tyrant caricature we sometimes get.
Right. He was a popular, engaged figure among his people. which made the American Rebellion feel like, well, not just a political problem, but a deeply personal insult to him and his loyal subjects.
It's also striking that even within Parliament, where you did have some opposition voices.
Yeah, figures like Wilkes and Burke.
Right. Even they didn't really question Britain's ultimate authority over the colonies, did they?
No, that was pretty much universal. John Wilkes, who was seen as quite radical, and Edmund Burke, a brilliant Whig intellectual, they did argue for the Americans. They urged conciliation. Burke gave some truly amazing speeches, like the one on March 22nd, pushing for a peaceful solution. But even Burke consistently called them our colonies. He never questioned Parliament's ultimate right to rule. The whole idea of American independence, it was still widely seen as just unthinkable, like sheer madness against the proper order of the empire.
And then the news starts trickling in from America. Lexington, Concord, Bunker Hill.
Yeah, and it's agonizingly slow, right? 3,000 miles of ocean. News of Lexington and Concord doesn't even hit London until late May. Bunker Hill, late July.
And you'd think maybe that news, especially Bunker Hill with the heavy British casualties.
You might think it would give them pause. But paradoxically, it only seemed to harden the king's resolve. It just solidified his conviction. He told Lord North, his prime minister, with total certainty, "We must persist. I know I am doing my duty and therefore can never wish to retract."
Even though Bunker Hill was technically a British win, the cost was huge.
Appalling. Over 1,000 casualties for House forces. A really bloody slaughter. And that was noted grimly back in London. It definitely raised questions about the price of these kinds of victories, but for the king, no turning back.
And Lord North, the prime minister, the king's sheet anchor, as they called him.
He dutifully supported the king, even though privately North was apparently quite worried about the immense costs of the war, and frankly, he didn't really have the temperament of a war leader. But he stayed loyal.
He even suggested reclassifying the whole thing.
Yeah, as a foreign war, which would basically allow for even more aggressive actions, stripping the Americans of any lingering rights they might have had as British subjects.
So the decision was made, more troops.
Immediately. The cabinet decided to send 2,000 reinforcements straight to Boston with this ambitious plan for 20,000 regulars to arrive by the next spring. The king secretly told North that, quote, every means of distressing America would meet with his full approval.
The feeling in London must have been pretty clear then.
Oh yeah, the perception was definitely that this rebellion would be crushed, swiftly and decisively.
Okay, so that's London. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, George Washington. A very, very different picture.
Completely different, almost heartbreaking, really. He privately admitted to what he called his uneasy hour.
Yeah.
On January 14, 1776, he wrote one of the most, well, forlorn letters of his entire life. He said, "The reflection upon my situation and that of this army produces many an uneasy hour when all around me are wrapped in sleep. Few people know the predicament we are in."
Wow. And his army, the one besieging Boston, they weren't exactly the picture of military discipline.
No, not at all. To put it mildly, they were a rabble in arms.
That was a British general's description.
Yeah, General John Burgoyne, he called them a preposterous parade, just full of disdain. And Washington himself was deeply dismayed. He complained about their almost total lack of regularity and discipline, and frankly, their lack of cleanliness.
These weren't professional soldiers.
Yeah, not in any way we'd recognize. They looked more like farmers from the fields than soldiers, often wearing these heavy homespun coats, often in tatters, just a bewildering variety of this and that, nothing like the uniformed European armies.
So Washington tried to bring some order.
He did. He ordered officers to wear colored ribbons to show rank, like major generals wore purple, brigadiers pink. Small things, but trying to impose some structure. And his own presence, always impeccably uniformed, mounted on a fine horse, was meant to set this kind of example of military bearing. Probably an unreachable example for most of them.
And the conditions in the camp itself sounds pretty grim.
Truly appalling.
Yeah.
There's a constant drain on morale, on health. There was a British ship surgeon who observed what he called inordinate quantities of rum being consumed daily. Calculated it was like a bottle a day per man.
Wow.
And Lieutenant Jabez Fitch, his diary entries talk about drinking grog, gin sling, cherry rum, often until daylight. Then there was camp fever, dysentery, putrid fever, just rampant, caused by infectious filth, open latrines, excrement about the fields perniciously.
Just horrible conditions.
Awful. Abigail Adams, who was staying near Boston, wrote tragically to John about her brother Elihu dying of dysentery. It paints this really vivid picture of an army struggling not just against the British, but against its own internal chaos and the brutal realities of, well, primitive camp life.
And yet, Despite all this chaos, the disarray, the harsh conditions, these soldiers had something else, didn't they?
They did, an inherent strength maybe. They were used to hard work, used to adversity. They were incredibly resourceful, shaped by frontier life. McCullough notes that rare was the man who had never seen someone die. Life was tough.
And there's that anecdote you mentioned about the soldier who was ready to desert.
Yeah, it's really powerful. This soldier, in an early skirmish, he's totally overwhelmed, thinking about running. Then he sees this Negro man, wound in the back of his neck, just walk past him, totally calm. Says he's just going to get a plaster put on it and then come back to the fight. And the soldier recounting this says, that moment of quiet, unassuming bravery just instantly gave him courage. He said, fear never troubled me afterward during the whole war. It's these kinds of unexpected flashes of individual spirit, defying all the military logic, that really shine through the chaos. They hint at this deeper resilience in the Army.
And Washington, amidst all this, he starts identifying key people, right? His objects of confidence.
Exactly. He had this keen eye for character. And he found leaders emerging like Nathaniel Greene and Henry Knox.
Greene was young, wasn't he?
Very, just 33, the youngest general officer. And his background was improbable. A founderman, a Quaker, he had a limp asthma. And remarkably, he'd never served in a campaign.
So how did he become a general?
He learned warfare almost entirely from books. Devoured Caesar, Horace in translation, Swift, Pope, Locke's essay concerning human understanding. He apparently even studied Euclid by the noise of the big trip hammer in his family's foundry.
Incredible dedication.
Totally. He just had this quick, inquiring mind and uncommon resolve, a real testament to being self-made.
And then Henry Knox. He sounds like quite a character.
Oh, definitely larger than life. A big, genial guy. Self-educated bookseller from Boston. His London bookstore was apparently a great resort for British officers and Tory ladies, which is interesting.
A bit ironic.
Yeah. But it was also where he and Greene really bonded over military art, talking strategy late into the night. And Washington, he saw something of himself in Knox. Both had lost their fathers young. Both were self-made men, driven by ambition, wanting to learn.
It's interesting how this army, this sort of civilian army, was different from the British.
Yeah, that's a key point McCullough makes. Unlike the rigid, hierarchical British military, the American Army was uniquely open to ideas and leadership from guys like Knox, a bookseller. This willingness to adapt, to elevate people based on merit, not just birth or formal training, was a striking difference, and it proved absolutely crucial later on.
That adaptability, that openness, it sounds like it was going to be absolutely vital for just surviving.
Oh, completely key. Because as that winter of 75-76 really set in, Washington's despair, it just deepened significantly.
He wrote that really stark letter in January.
Yeah, where he basically said, if he'd known what was coming, the immense burdens, he'd have rather just taken my musket upon my shoulders and entered the ranks. The Army felt like it was literally coming apart. Not enough powder, constant money shortages, soldiers deserting with their guns, just desperate to get back to their farms, their families. It was a monumental crisis.
But then, amidst all that darkness, this sort of glimmer of light appears. Henry Knox's plan.
Yes, Knox's audacious, almost crazy plan. He proposed bringing 60 tons of cannons, mortars, military gear, all the way from Fort Ticonderoga in upstate New York.
Which is how far?
A staggering 300 miles.
Yeah.
To Boston. In winter. It wasn't just bold. McCullough calls it virtually impossible.
The logistics must have been insane.
Unbelievable. Think about it. Rough forest roads, freezing lakes, blizzards, thaws, mountain wilderness, and repeated mishaps. They hit a cruel thaw that turned roads into just muck, ankle-deep or worse. Then 3 feet of snow fell on Christmas Day.
Just relentless.
Totally. Yet somehow, against all odds, as this procession of guns slowly, painfully made its way across the landscape, people started turning out along the route just to see it for themselves, witnessing this extraordinary feat of sheer human willpower and ingenuity. It was an early, really powerful symbol of American determination.
And Knox actually pulling this off, that must have been huge for morale.
Critical, absolutely critical turning point. And it was amplified by another amazing stroke of luck, the capture of that British supply ship, the brig Nancy.
Right, the military treasure.
Exactly. It brought in an incredible haul. 2,500 stands of arms, cannons, mortars, thousands of flints, 40 tons of shot, 2,000 bayonets. McCullough notes it was nearly everything needed but powder. Gunpowder was still this constant nail-biting worry.
But still, this combination, Knox's mission succeeding and capturing the Nancy Wad, it gave them the firepower they desperately needed.
It did. It gave the Continental Army the actual means to confront the British in Boston.
Yeah.
It really transformed that despair into this sort of burgeoning, fragile hope.
And you can see Washington's determination kind of rekindle with these new resources. He's getting ready to, as he put it, bring on a rumpus.
Yeah, he's back in action mode. And it's fascinating, isn't it, that even with all this crushing pressure, the fate of this whole enterprise on his shoulders, he still finds time to write to Phyllis Wheatley.
The young black poet.
Exactly. Praising her great poetical talents. It just shows this different, really human side of Washington, appreciating talent, artistry, regardless of background, even while dealing with these immense strategic burdens. It speaks to a certain breadth of character we don't always see.
So then comes the strategic move, Dorchester Heights.
Yes, his strategic genius comes right to the fore. The plan. Fortify Dorchester Heights, this high ground overlooking Boston Harbor, perfect for placing those newly acquired cannons.
Surprise was key.
Absolutely. Washington ordered total secrecy, and he gave his troops these really stern warnings. If any man in action shall presume to skulk, he will be instantly shot down, as an example of cowardice.
That's pretty harsh.
It is. But it wasn't just a military order, it was psychological too, reinforcing how serious this was, the gravity of the mission, and the commander's iron will.
And the actual execution of the plan, it sounds almost too perfect.
It really does seem almost miraculous, a combination of incredible human effort and just unbelievably favorable conditions. The night of March 4th to 5th was unseasonably mild. McCullough says, perfectly beautiful, with a full moon.
But they needed cover, right?
Yes, and crucially, a strategic haze rolled in, concealing their efforts from the British down below. Reverend William Gordon and many others genuinely believed it was providential. He said, a finer night for working could not have been taken.
Thousands of men working through the night.
Tirelessly, breaking frozen ground, filling these things called chandeliers, which were big, heavy wooden frames they filled with earth to create barriers, along with barrels packed with earth and stone. And by dawn on March 5th, incredibly, 20 cannons were in place, perfectly sighted, ready to fire, utterly shocking the British.
And General Howe, the British commander, he hadn't seen this coming at all.
Not the slightest. He dismissed any threat to Dorchester, famously said something like, "We're not under the least apprehension of an attack on this place by surprise or otherwise."
That famous indifference, or maybe arrogance.
Yeah, maybe an overreaching sense of superiority towards Washington and the American army. McCullough paints Howe as often being slow, procrastinating, unless there was some immediate, obvious action needed. And Washington just exploited that trait perfectly with this daring move. This underestimation, it was a recurring theme for the British early on.
So the next morning, the British wake up and see these fortifications.
Absolute astonishment and mortification. Howe immediately saw their position was impossible. American cannons now overlooked their fleet, the city itself. Boston was totally untenable.
So he calls off his own planned attack.
Immediately. And orders the evacuation of Boston. One British officer wrote, just full of disbelief, "Never were troops in so disgraceful a situation." The city itself just descended into utmost frenzy.
With the Loyalists trying to get out too.
Yes, 1,100 Loyalists scrambling to leave along with thousands of British troops. Chaos. They're dumping supplies into the harbor, destroying landmarks like the Liberty Tree for firewood, deliberately damaging the Old North Church. Just a desperate, messy scramble.
And for those Loyalists, it must have been devastating.
Immense human cost. They were forced to leave virtually all they owned, abandoning homes, businesses, their whole lives. Dr. Sylvester Gardner, a prominent loyalist, wrote about the lawless rebels and feeling like he was under a worser state of tyranny than British rule.
These weren't just the elites either.
No, not at all. Shopkeepers, artisans, farmers, whole families like William Hill, a baker who left with 17 family members. It really highlights those deep, painful divisions the war created within American society, forcing people into these devastating choices.
Then Washington enters Boston. Or rather, lets General Ward have the honor.
Yes, a remarkably gracious gesture from Washington. He gave the honor of the triumphal entry to General Artemas Ward, and the joy among the Bostonians was apparently inexplicably great.
And the new flag goes up?
Yeah, the new flag with the 13 red and white stripes, a really potent symbol of these emerging independent states, gets raised on Prospect Hill. Apparently, the British initially mistook it for a flag of surrender.
Ah, the irony.
Exactly. It was just this powerful visual symbol of a tide that was truly shifting, not just militarily, but psychologically.
But Washington knew this wasn't the end, right?
No. Even in that moment of profound victory, with his usual foresight, he recognized greater difficulties were definitely ahead. John Hancock warned him about British rage of disappointment and revenge.
They weren't just going to sail away.
Not a chance. But the evacuation of Boston, which many, including Washington himself, attributed partly to the intervening hand of God, it was a huge turning point. And it happened right around the time Thomas Paine's common sense was having this electrifying effect.
Changing minds everywhere.
Massively. Washington noted it was causing a powerful change in people's thinking. Paine had famously written, "The sun never shined on a cause of greater worth," arguing that everything that is right or reasonable pleads for separation. The war was about to enter a completely new phase, no longer just about rights as Englishmen, but about absolute declared independence.
So the army finally moves out of Boston, heading south to New York.
Yep, after being pretty much stuck around Boston for a year, they're on the move. And Washington knew New York was strategically vital. But he arrives there without any real naval strength, facing this huge city bounded by navigable rivers, a massive harbor. He knew he had no illusions about the difficulties to be faced. He understood the scale of the challenge.
And New York itself was different from Boston, wasn't it? In terms of loyalty.
Vastly different, a huge challenge. New York was a major loyalist stronghold, deeply divided. McCullough points out that something like 2/3 of the property in the city belonged to Tories. More than half the New York Chamber of Commerce were openly loyalists.
So not exactly friendly territory.
Far from it. Even a brave sermon by Reverend John Rogers, urging men to fight for their country, just highlighted how deep those divisions ran. And crucially, unlike Boston, where Washington had pretty good intelligence.
Here it was the opposite.
Exactly. The situation was tragically the reverse. The British often knew more about American strengths and plans than Washington did. Made effective defense incredibly difficult.
Then comes the Declaration of Independence, arriving in New York.
Yes, it's formally read aloud to the troops. And this wasn't just, another piece of paper. It immediately transformed the whole conflict. No longer just fighting for abstract liberties as Englishmen.
Now it's explicitly for independence.
It's exactly. A proudly proclaimed all-out war for an independent America. It gave the soldiers this immediate, powerful, fresh incentive. They knew exactly what was at stake now.
And the symbolism of pulling down the king's statue.
Oh yeah, powerful stuff. This cheering, ecstatic mob storms Bowling Green, pulls down that big gilded lead statue of George III, hacks off his head, and then the ultimate act of defiance, much of the lead gets melted down for bullets. Someone apparently suggested it was to assimilate with the brains of our infatuated adversaries.
Wow. But that feeling, that sort of revolutionary fervor, it didn't last long undisturbed, did it?
No, it was brutally quickly dashed.
Yeah.
Just 3 days after the Declaration was read, July 12, 1776, the British arrive in overwhelming force.
The fleet filling the harbor.
Just a dramatic, terrifying sight. 32,000 troops. That's more people than the entire population of New York City or even Philadelphia at the time.
Unimaginable scale.
Totally. Joseph Reed, Washington's secretary, just expressed this profound astonishment. "I cannot help being astonished that a people should come 3,000 miles to rob, plunder, and destroy another people. It was an overwhelming display of imperial power."
And then comes the battle, Long Island, which did not go well for the Americans.
No, it was a crushing, absolutely devastating defeat. Washington made a critical error. He assumed the British would attack head-on, like at Bunker Hill or Dorchester.
So he prepared for that.
Yes, but crucially, he left the Jamaica Pass, this relatively unguarded route around the American flank, he left it unattended. A fatal miscalculation. And Howe exploited it perfectly.
How's flanking maneuver?
Brilliant, really. Generals Clinton and Cornwallis led their forces through that pass in utmost silence and extremely slowly during a cool night march, completely bypassed the American main defenses.
So the Americans were taken by surprise.
Totally surprised. Led to wild confusion and swirling snow. Not literal snow, obviously, but the chaos, dust, smoke of battle creating this disorienting, swirling mess. Even though they were vastly outnumbered, the Americans did return fire with murderous effect in places. It was desperate, chaotic fighting. Officers on both sides often had no clue what was happening just yards away. Pure chaos of 18th century battle.
And the stories about the Hessians.
Yeah, accounts of Hessian brutality spread like wildfire afterwards, bayoneting surrendered soldiers, pinning them to trees. McCullough is careful to say that while individual atrocities definitely happened in the heat of battle, the absolute most gruesome reports were probably fabricated as propaganda to demonize the German mercenaries.
But the fear was real.
Oh, the fear they inspired was very real, very psychologically impactful. And amidst all this chaos, Lord Stirling, He was this colorful guy claiming a Scottish title. He showed extraordinary valor. Led his small force in this desperate rearguard action, held out for nearly 4 hours against impossible odds.
Before being captured.
Yeah, finally surrounded. But even then, he specifically chose to surrender his sword to the Hessian General von Heister, not to the British, maintaining the sort of defiant dignity right to the end.
So from the British side, this looked like total victory.
Undoubtedly. A glorious day, they called it. A cheap and complete victory. General Grant sneered, something like, "If a good bleeding can bring those Bible-faced Yankees to their senses, the fever of independency should soon abate."
They thought it was over.
Pretty much. Confident the Americans would never again stand before us in the field. General Clinton was so sure he expected to be home by Christmas. Rebellion crushed.
But then, the retreat. The miracle of the Brooklyn retreat.
Yes. Despite this awful defeat, what happens next is astonishing. The American army is completely hemmed in, backs to the East River, facing this literal trap ready to spring if the wind changed and let the British Navy sail up the river.
A desperate situation. How did Washington react?
His composure in this crisis was just extraordinary. He kept this cool but determined leadership, making his rounds in the pouring rain, personally checking on men, logistics. He kept any anger or torment or despair totally hidden. Presented this unflappable front to his exhausted, defeated army. That stoicism was absolutely crucial.
And the escape itself sounds incredibly complex.
Ingenious. It happens overnight, August 29th to 30th, under the cover of darkness and then helped by this thick fog that rolled in just as the sun came up, concealing the final stages.
Colonel Glover's men were key, right? The Marbleheaders.
Absolutely vital. Colonel John Glover's Marblehead Mariners, these skilled sailors and fishermen from Massachusetts, they performed a logistical masterpiece, battling strong currents, the tide, to ferry 9,000 men plus horses and cannons across the East River, trip after tireless trip.
All in silence.
Total silence. Wagon wheels muffled with cloth, orders whispered. Silence was strictly enjoined not to speak or even cough. And Washington himself was right there at the ferry landing, supervising personally. He stayed on the Brooklyn side until the very last boat left, making sure every man he could save got across. It was desperate, daring, and incredibly successfully executed.
And the British just missed it.
Completely missed it. They were utterly astonished the next morning to find the American camp empty. Still couldn't quite figure out how they'd managed this precipitate retreat. So yes, it was a massive defeat in battle for the Americans.
Was it not the end?
Exactly. Strategically, it was not a decisive victory for the British. Washington and his 9,000 troops, though badly beaten, had survived to fight another day. A crucial testament to their resilience and the daring leadership that saved them from being totally wiped out. It was this shift from battlefield loss to strategic, almost miraculous survival, kept the cause alive.
But the aftermath of Brooklyn, the mood must have been terrible.
Oh, abysmal. This deep, pervasive despair just settled over the army. Desertion became epidemic, truly heartbreaking. Soldiers deserting as if leaving a sinking ship, 30 or 40 at a time, often just walking off with their arms and ammunition. They just lost faith.
Whole units leaving.
Yeah, entire Connecticut militia units just departed en masse. Their short enlistment terms were up and they had had enough. The roads leading away from the army were just full of these disheartened soldiers heading home, many spreading this really corrosive discouragement.
Oh.
And tragically, about 1 in 4 carried disease back with them from the awful camps.
The personal cost must have been huge for individuals, too.
Immense. McCullough tells the story of Lieutenant Joseph Hodgkins, the cobbler, veteran of Bunker Hill. He gets this heavy news from home: his small, sick son has died.
Devastating.
Absolutely crushing personal tragedy. And the army situation is dire, yet he resolves to stay. Writes to his wife, tells her, "I had my sleeve button shot out of my sleeve and the skin a little grazed, but through mercy received no other hurt." No mention of giving up, just this profound personal commitment.
But not everyone felt that way. Washington's leadership was being questioned.
Openly questioned. Soldiers were longing for General Lee to come back. Many saw him as more aggressive. Colonel John Hazlitt famously said, "I fear General Washington has too heavy a task, assisted mostly by beardless boys." Ouch.
And then the betrayal from within his own circle, Joseph Reed.
Yeah, that's a really stunning indictment.
Yeah.
Reed, Washington's indispensable secretary, his confidant, he secretly writes to General Charles Lee, expresses his totally shattered confidence in Washington's indecisive mind, goes so far as to suggest Lee should be leading the army.
Wow. Washington didn't know about this at the time.
No, not then. But Reed's frustration was clear. He wrote something like, "Your noisy sons of liberty are, I find, the quietest in the field." This hidden betrayal just speaks volumes about the immense strain on morale, on leadership. It threatened to unravel the whole thing.
Then comes the actual fall of New York City.
Swift and brutal. The British landing at Kip's Bay on September 15th. The bombardment from the warships created a terrible and so incessant a roar of guns, just terrified the untrained American troops. They were seen flying in every direction in pell-mell panic as the Redcoats advanced.
And Washington's reaction?
Pure fury, a rare loss of control. He rode right to within 100 yards of the enemy, desperately trying to rally his fleeing men. His aides had to, with difficulty, pull him back from the field before he got himself killed or captured.
So New York falls.
Swiftly occupied. Jubilant loyalists welcoming the British. Famously, a woman tore down the Continental flag at the Battery and raised the Union Jack, a really bitter symbol of defeat.
But there was that small bright spot, Harlem Heights.
Yes, the very next day, September 16th. A small but strategically important skirmish at Harlem Heights. It gave the Americans this urgently needed lift to their self-respect.
Why was it so important?
Because after days of just retreat and humiliation, they finally stood their ground. Inflicted casualties, actually saw the backs of redcoats on the fly. British and Hessian losses were maybe 90 killed, 300 wounded. American losses fewer than 100 wounded, 30 killed, though that included Colonel Knowlton, a skilled leader, which was a blow. Still, it was a psychological win. It proved they could still fight.
But the suffering continued. The Great Fire.
Yeah, September 20th. The Great Fire of New York consumes about a quarter of the city, wiped out the notorious Holy Ground slum and brothel district, and the historic Trinity Church at Skeeple became this vast pyramid of fire.
And Nathan Hale's story happens around then, too.
Yes, amidst that devastation. The tragic story of Nathan Hale, just 21, Yale graduate schoolmaster, volunteered to spy for Washington, bravely went behind enemy lines.
And got caught.
Yeah, likely because he naively confided his mission to the wrong person, maybe a loyalist or a British agent. On September 21st, he was hanged. Uttered those iconic last words, "I only regret that I have but one life to lose for my country." A stark, personal reminder of the real, deadly cost of intelligence and the profound individual sacrifices being made.
So after New York falls, the retreat continues across New Jersey.
Agonizingly. A real test of sheer endurance. Washington, though he kept up that outwardly imperturbable demeanor, was clearly sinking deeper into discouragement, misery. He made that famous statement about militia.
The broken staff.
Exactly. To place any dependence on militia is, assuredly, resting upon a broken staff. Weariness born of hard, bitter experience. He even privately considered the unthinkable, retreating way out to western Pennsylvania, maybe wage a predatory war from beyond the Allegheny Mountains if he had to. Recognizing how huge the country was, something the British maybe didn't grasp, and the possibility of a long guerrilla campaign, it just shows the utter desperation.
And then another major blow, Fort Washington.
Yes, a major, painful strategic blunder. Holding on to Fort Washington, even after it was clear the Hudson River couldn't be defended against British ships, they'd sailed right past it easily on October 9th.
But Greene thought they could hold it.
Yeah, Nathaniel Greene, usually so astute, confidently but mistakenly assured Washington the army was strongly positioned there and could hold it. It led to this painful humiliation. On November 15th, a massive Hessian-led frontal assault.
Heavy losses.
Huge. 2,800 Americans captured. Nearly a third of Washington's remaining army gone in one blow. An all-out slaughter was only averted because the Hessian general Knyphausen, seeing the scale of the rout, finally ordered his angry, vengeful Hessians to stop bayoneting the fleeing Americans, a crushing defeat.
So the retreat becomes this fox chase.
Exactly. Cornwallis, with 10,000 well-equipped troops, relentlessly pursuing Washington's dwindling, ragged army across New Jersey. Conditions were just brutal. Rain-drenched roads, in muck ankle-deep or worse. Men hauling heavy wagons, cannon, often with frostbitten feet.
That story about the kettle.
Yeah, Private Joseph Martin vividly remembered lugging this heavy cast-iron kettle until his arms felt like they were nearly dislocated. Finally, just had to abandon it in sheer exhaustion. And beyond the physical hardship, there were the horrific ravages in New Jersey.
Plundering, violence.
Widespread plundering, rape, abuse by British and Hessian troops, often guided by resentful local loyalists. Nathaniel Greene reported damningly many hundred women ravished. It paints this stark, brutal picture of the war's increasing savagery, its devastating impact on civilians. This wasn't the kind of gentlemanly conflict some had imagined.
By early December, the situation looks hopeless.
Utterly dire. Nathaniel Greene summed it up with chilling frankness on December 1st.
We had not 3,000 men, a very pitiful army to trust the liberties of America on.
Wow, 3,000 men. Pitifully small. And Washington himself, in a moment of profound despair, wrote that if the new enlistments didn't come through, if this desperate hope for a new army failed, the game is pretty near up. Congress even packed up and fled Philadelphia for Baltimore, fearing the British advance. The whole enterprise, the nascent nation, was truly teetering on the very brink of collapse. Annihilation seemed imminent.
But then, out of that absolute abyss, that darkest hour, comes this incredibly audacious gamble.
Yes. Washington decides on this daring, almost suicidal counterattack across the icy Delaware River against the Hessians stationed at Trenton on Christmas night, 1776.
The conditions for crossing must have been horrendous.
Harrowing. It was nearly dark and raining at McConkey's Ferry. You could hear Henry Knox's unmistakable booming bass voice just bellowing orders over the storm, the churning river. Knox himself later praised the sheer heroic effort of Colonel Glover's Marblehead mariners.
Battling the ice.
Huge chunks of ice, treacherous currents, ferrying 2,400 men, horses, and those precious cannons across that dangerous river, often in real peril themselves.
And they were delayed.
Yes, by 3 crucial hours, which pushed the attack into daylight, losing that element of complete surprise. But Washington's resolve, utterly unwavering. He explained later with that characteristic determination, "As I was certain there was no making a retreat without being discovered, I determined to push on at all events. No turning back now."
The march to Trenton itself sounds just as brutal.
Equally miserable. 4 miles through freezing temperatures, slippery, icy roads. John Greenwood, the young fifer who survived it, vividly remembered being benumbed with cold, desperately wanting to just lie down and sleep. And he noted chillingly, 2 of the men did freeze to death on that march. It was just pure, unadulterated willpower pushing them forward.
Meanwhile, the Hessian commander in Trenton, Colonel Rall, he wasn't expecting this.
Not at all. Fatal overconfidence. And a shocking disregard for intelligence. He'd received explicit warnings from General Grant, even from a local loyalist who got a message to him. But Rall apparently just thrust into his pocket unread. He just didn't anticipate an attack of this size or audacity, especially not in that weather. On Christmas night, his arrogance was his undoing.
So the attack begins.
Just after 8 a.m., Greene's column moving at a long trot. They surprise the Hessians. The storm is at the Americans' backs, but blowing right into the faces of the enemy, blinding them. Swift, brutal house-to-house fighting. Colonel Rall is mortally wounded early on.
And the outcome?
Absolutely astounding. Almost unbelievable, given where they'd been just days before. 21 Hessians killed, 90 wounded, and a staggering 900 captured.
And American casualties.
Incredible. Only 4 Americans wounded in the actual battle, and 0 killed in combat, excluding, of course, the 2 poor souls who froze to death on the march. It was as close to a perfect victory against a veteran force as you could imagine.
The impact must have been immediate.
Profound. Instantaneous boost to morale across the army, across the colonies. Washington, who rarely showered praise, declared in heartfelt terms he did not see a single instance of bad behavior among his troops. A huge compliment from him.
And the news spread
like wildfire. Young John Adlam, an American who'd been captured earlier, described his frantic excitement hearing the news. He literally ran right through British sentinels to share it with his fellow prisoners. Even some on the British side, like Colonel William Harcourt, had to begrudgingly admit that the rabble had suddenly become a formidable enemy.
Though not everyone saw it that way.
No, General Grant was still fuming, called it an infamous business, a cursed affair. Just couldn't comprehend how they'd been so thoroughly outplayed.
But Washington doesn't stop there. He doesn't just rest on this victory.
No, he's not going to let this precious momentum slip away. He makes another audacious decision. Go after the enemy again. Cross the Delaware a second time, just days later. This time with 40 cannons.
But his army was about to dissolve, wasn't it? Enlistments expiring.
Literally on the verge of dissolving. So he makes his pivotal, intensely personal plea directly to his weary troops. Especially the New Englanders, the ones who'd served the longest, suffer the most. Ask them to just stay on for 6 more weeks.
How did McCullough describe that moment?
Vividly. The soldiers, exhausted, just looking down, shuffling their feet in the snow. Then Washington speaks, his voice apparently ringing with emotion, appealing to their patriotism, their honor. And slowly, one by one, then in small groups, they start to step forward. An incredibly powerful moment of recommitment to a cause that had seemed utterly lost just days before.
Then the move towards Princeton, another brilliant maneuver.
Yes, he outmaneuvers Cornwallis with this fantastic deceptive night march, these campfires burning as a ruse, making the British think they're still encamped, slips away towards Princeton.
And in the battle itself, Washington leads from the front.
Absolutely. His personal courage at Princeton was legendary, riding right among his men, exposing himself to extreme danger. McCullough quotes someone saying, his important life hanging, as it were, by a single hair, rallying them with shouts like, "Parade with us, my brave fellows."
And as the British break...
Yes, the British retreat in disarray, Washington, caught up in the sheer exhilaration of the moment, famously cries out, "It's a fine fox chase, my boys." A rare moment of just unbridled joy and triumph for the normally reserved commander.
So these two battles, Trenton and Princeton, they really change everything.
They mark this immortal turn for the American cause. Nathaniel Greene summed it up perfectly. The two late actions have put a very different face upon affairs. Trenton, especially, was the huge psychological turning point. It showed Americans for the very first time that they actually could best the enemy in a straight fight.
And people saw Washington differently after this.
Definitely. Abigail Adams, always so perceptive, wrote that our later misfortunes have called out the hidden excellencies of our commander-in-chief. She loved that quote from Edward Young. Affliction is the good man's shining time. And McCullough really drives this home. Washington never appeared to so much advantage as in the hour of distress.
But we have to remember the cost, right? McCullough emphasizes this.
Absolutely. He concludes 1776 so powerfully by reminding us that while we celebrate that year as the nation's birth year, for the people who actually lived through it, who fought in it, it was a year of sustained suffering, disease, hunger, desertion, cowardice, disillusionment, defeat, terrible discouragement, and fear.
But also courage.
Yes. Crucially, it was also a year of phenomenal courage and bedrock devotion to country. And the true human cost was staggering. An estimated 25,000 American lives lost in the war overall. That's roughly 1% of the entire population at the time, making it, percentage-wise, the costliest war in American history except for the Civil War. It was a year of profound human struggle, profound sacrifice, often kind of glossed over in the celebratory glow of independence.
So when we reflect on 1776 today, it's really about seeing beyond that simplified myth, isn't it? Appreciating that immense human cost, the individual struggles, the sheer audacity of people who just kept going when everything seemed absolutely lost.
Exactly. Remembering not just the big names, Washington, Paine, but the ragamuffins, the ordinary soldiers, the cobblers like Joseph Hodgkins, the self-taught generals like Greene and Knox.
And figures like Molly Corbin.
Yeah, Molly Corbin, the soldier's wife at the Battle of Fort Washington. Her husband's killed loading a cannon, and she just steps right into his place, starts loading and firing the cannon herself until she falls wounded too. Those stories are absolutely central to understanding what happened.
That perseverance and spirit Washington talked about, it wasn't just talk.
Not at all. It was forged in that daily struggle for survival, punctuated by these moments of just astonishing bravery, strategic brilliance, often from totally unexpected places. It was that deep well of human resilience that ultimately carried them through those absolute darkest hours.
So here's a thought for you as you reflect on the year 1776. Consider this. What seemingly small, maybe desperate act performed today in the face of what looked like overwhelming odds might be quietly shaping the future right now in ways we can barely even imagine.
It's a powerful thought, and if you want to dive deeper into these incredible stories, really feel the grit and the triumph of this pivotal year, we absolutely recommend reading David McCullough's book, 1776. It's just an immersive experience. It brings this crucial period of American history vividly, powerfully to life,